All right. Well, hey, welcome this week to River Share to everybody. Uh, Today we're going to have Greg Jennings uh, present for us. It's a pre-recorded presentation on floodplain restoration along the French Broad River in near Asheville, North Carolina, and basically how he looks at trying to support vital habitats with restoration and how this may look a little bit different than standard natural channel design and how we can use references in places that don't always um, we can't always find a reference for exactly what we're trying to reproduce. So, can everybody hear me okay this morning?
Yes, sir.
Good, good. And always when I play a video, I always have a little bit of an issue with the sound. So hopefully I can get the sound to play right for us. Everybody can hear that. All right. Now here we go. So Greg Jennings.
Today, I'm going to talk about floodplain restoration as a form of improving environmental conditions, and in particular, a set of projects working on the French Broad River in western North Carolina to support vital habitats. And I'll explain all of these terms as I go along. The photo on the screen is an aerial view of the Pleasant Grove floodplain, which is one of the case studies I'll discuss as we go along. This is on a 70-acre former golf course, and before that, a dairy farm, which is now an ecosystem restoration project along the French Broad River. And so this is essentially a presentation that I gave earlier this year to the North Carolina chapter of American Fisheries Society. And my collaborators on this and other projects here in Western North Carolina are Luke Etchison and Scott Loftus with the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission, and David Lee with Conserving Carolina, who represents a large group of conservation focused land preservation and conservation restoration team members with nonprofit groups here in Western North Carolina. What is floodplain restoration? Well, some terms here that we are all somewhat familiar with: the idea of adjusting the physical and biological conditions toward improved ecological functions and services. And I'll develop that more as we go along. I also want to point out that floodplain restoration is a form of rewilding, rewilding being a term that ecological engineers and restoration ecologists have been using for a few decades as an overall concept of returning a highly disturbed ecosystem into a more natural wild system that performs a variety of services. In particular, on floodplains, of course, we see habitats for a variety of aquatic and terrestrial species, as well as birds. And we see water quality, treatment functions, and floodplain water storage functions. So the idea that a floodplain stores and treats water during overbank flows or during stormwater runoff capture events provides downstream values and as well as local values to the communities. The photo that you see here is the project we refer to as Mouth of Mud Creek floodplain. Mud Creek is a tributary to the French Broad River in western North Carolina, and Mud Creek at its confluence flows through a 100-acre floodplain area, which is now in permanent protection by Conserving Carolina, the local land conservancy. And in the background of this photo, you can see a housing development that's in a slightly elevated situation where the stormwater runoff from that housing development flows through a linear wetland system now into a backwater slough, which is all part of the overall ecological restoration project there at mouth of Mud Creek. And I'll discuss that project more as we go along as well. Rewilding a stream plus floodplain ecosystem is really a common approach in many of our projects, and yours too, I'm sure. The idea that reconnecting a stream to its floodplain and allowing that floodplain to then turn to natural vegetation with potentially some low-lying areas or vernal pool type habitat areas is a common restoration approach in stream restoration. The photos here are a project we refer to as Bat Fork at the Dodd Meadows Community Center. This is a housing development developed actually by Habitat for Humanity here in Henderson County, North Carolina. And we were able to work with the owners of the property, the Habitat for Humanity Foundation, to return this very incised ditch, if you will, to a more natural functioning wild ecosystem with a trail and garden area along the stream, and also opportunities for some of the people in the community, including children, to access the area and learn about stream ecology. Rewilding in general transforms this disturbed landscape back to nature to restore these natural processes, enhance connectivity, provide wildlife values as well as human values. And in some cases, we may reintroduce a keystone species that is missing. And I'll talk about some examples of that as we move through a couple of other slides here. This particular project is in a more urban watershed, and you can actually see the sewer line manhole in the floodplain. So typical utilities, overhead transmission of power, as well as buried utilities like sewer lines, present opportunities for interfacing between nature and the human-built infrastructure. The French Broad River watershed is tributary to the Tennessee River and eventually to the Mississippi. So the French Broad in North Carolina is headwatered in Transylvania County, which is in the lower portion of the slide on the right. And the French Broad River generally flows from south to north, where it enters Tennessee and becomes part of the Tennessee River Valley system. In North Carolina, there are several dams. The stop signs that you see on the map are the dams, and those dams have been there a long time. And there are barriers for fish migration. And so what we have seen is a severe decline in the range of native fishes, and in some areas, complete lack of any observations of some of the native fishes. Luke Etchison is a fish biologist with our State Wildlife Resources Commission, and this information was provided by Luke. Historically, there were 76 species of native fish in the French Broad River Basin. There are currently more than 26 non-native fish species, many of which were introduced for various recreational or food purposes over the past 300 years. A majority of historical fish species are still found in Madison County, which is at the north end of the French Broad in North Carolina. So downstream toward Tennessee, we still have a majority of the native historical fish species found. But in the upper French Broad, upstream of the three dams, there are approximately half of the species are missing entirely from that upper French Broad River watershed area, which consists primarily of Transylvania County, Henderson County, and Buncombe County, which is where Asheville is located. In the French Broad River Basin, lots of science is going on, lots of restoration activity. There have been a number of grant-funded projects to work toward rewilding or restoration of some of the habitat areas. And two that in particular that I'll talk about are the two I mentioned previously, the Pleasant Grove project, which is in the lower right photo, is the farthest upstream near Etowah, North Carolina, and the mouth of Mud Creek project, which is further downstream in Henderson County near the Asheville Airport. So these two projects are two examples of a planned 10 total floodplain slough restorations that are either fully designed and funded or in planning stages for the next 4 to 6 years. Also mention that we have endangered mussels, including the Appalachian elk toe mussel, and you'll see the gray circles indicating where those were found before 2013 and the yellow circles indicating where they're found now. So a decline in the number of observations of those species, and they're very much affected by siltation due to runoff of sediment and stream bank erosion, which is a dominant source of sediment in the upper French Broad River Basin. Floodplain connection and slough creation being a big opportunity where we have areas of floodplain that have been previously used for agriculture and in some cases recreation that are inundated by overbank flows and available to acquire and restore to more natural functions. These projects are helping to stabilize in-stream habitat and providing essential spawning grounds, nursery habitat, and some high flow refuge. So I'll define exactly what we are talking about with regard to sloughs in just a minute. I also want to make note that floodwater storage is an overall objective, and quantifying that can be somewhat difficult. But in terms of allowing that water during high flows to get onto the floodplain and remain on the floodplain, we could document a few percent reduction in downstream flooding volume depending on the size of the storm and the retention of water on the floodplain. But each of these projects incrementally adds to that overall floodwater reduction. Starting with mouth of Mud Creek, then, this one goes back 5 years. I was fortunate enough to work with this team of conservation professionals from the state, federal agencies, and environmental groups, and local county soil and water conservation, working on this project with lots of objectives that we've already discussed previously, but wetlands, floodwater storage, habitats, educational research opportunities, opportunity to bring science and bring children, young adults, college students, neighbors, community, volunteers, everybody together to learn and learn from this project, but also communicate how important it is to preserve and restore floodplain functions. The photos that you see here show different areas on the restored floodplain within 3 years after the construction. This was completed in 2020, so 4 years ago in the spring, and it included moving approximately 15,000 cubic yards of earth within the property essentially excavating wetland areas, slowing water down, and excavating backwater sloughs, which are connected to the river directly. Historically, the river had many of these sloughs, which are often seen as rivers meander through wide valleys as remnant channels. They could be former primary channels that are left behind, and the fish species of interest here could use those for habitat and reproduction. In particular, we have the southernmost habitat for native muskellunge or muskie, which need these backwater sloughs for rearing of young. And because of the lack of these habitats, the muskie has not been found to reproduce in the French Broad River Basin for at least a century. And so all of the muskie that are currently found in the river have been reared in a nursery hatchery operation by our State Wildlife Resource Commission and released into the wild for recreational fisheries. Major goal here is to determine what the fish are using these backwater sloughs for, how they're using them, and long-term to find that they are reproducing naturally using these sloughs. So the photo on the lower left is Scott Loftus with our Wildlife Resources Commission standing on a platform where we have a detector system with a antenna connected to wires flowing under or going under the slough. And as fish migrate up and down through the sloughs, a tag that is embedded under the skin of each fish triggers a signal that tells us which fish is using the slough. And so I will get to some data about that in just a minute. Overall, this project addressed a 100-acre property. We had funding from a variety of state and federal sources, all grants. All these grants required permanent protection and required native plants and long-term stewardship on the property. So the Conserving Carolina Land Conservancy is maintaining and fully responsible for the project. The French Broad River itself flows in a meandering form down valley from the bottom of the stream to the top. And the floodplain on both sides is primarily historically used for agriculture. The floodplain on the right side is our property where we did the project. It was used as corn and hay production until 5 years ago. The photo then on the lower left is November of 2013, shows the housing development, which sits up at a higher elevation, and the 100 acres of primarily farmland on the floodplain. Interestingly, we can see that historically floodwaters would overtop the bank and flow across this peninsula, if you will. And that would indicate that the river does have the opportunity to migrate, and it certainly is able to access occasionally over the banks. Historically, the landowners had pushed up levees of soil, concrete, other debris to try to keep the river out. And so we had typically had riverbank berms ranging from 5 to 8 feet high in some places, with minor breaches and opportunities to remove many of those berms to promote more frequent overbank flow. On the lower right, then, the photo from last year shows the condition of the property post restoration construction. And starting on the upper left, this is one of the backwater sloughs. This is a 2-acre slough that was excavated in a remnant oxbow or former channel where now the fish can easily migrate in and out from the river. There is another slough up valley, but in the lower part of the photo. And that slough is connected to a long linear wetland, which is where the stormwater runoff from the housing development flows. In general, the project addressed hydrology and vegetation on the overall 100 acres of floodplain. And so this drawing highlights the different project elements, the musky habitat zone or slough, the depressional wetlands, the plugged ditches that created retained water zones, the linear braided wetland system that replaced an ag ditch that receives the stormwater runoff, and the three different backwater sloughs that provide the extra habitat value. Excavation started in spring of 2020. I mentioned included plugging ditches, removing berms, moving soil from the excavated wetlands, and providing the values that we see now in the photos. We have the depressional areas where floodwater is stored, runoff from the housing development. We have the community of plants developing. There were plants installed, but also mostly allowing nature to re-inhabit with the plant communities that were already present on site. We have lots of photos of different plants developing over the past 4 years, and then also developing opportunities for the science on the site, the study of the water quality, the fish habitat, and a variety of plant communities. There's an upland area that has a pollinator field, about 4 acres, for promoting that type of ecological value. And there is, of course, a wide variety of wetland areas that store water. The fish habitat sloughs I mentioned previously, one is about 2 acres, one's about 1 acre. They're both being monitored for fish access. The important time of year for the muskie to access these sloughs for reproduction is in the spring. On the photo on the left is Scott Loftus holding a muskie. They can get up to 5 feet in length. They're very large fish. They live a long time. They're at the top of the food chain in terms of aquatic species, so they eat just about anything. And they're considered a highly valued game fish, so people come there to fish for the muskie. 42 different animals have been detected moving in and out of the sloughs. Many of them have repeated visits to the various sloughs over a 4-year period. The science indicates that muskie will return to the slough in which they were born. And within this 20-mile reach of the French Broad River Basin, there are approximately 100 different animals with tags, and they move back and forth throughout that reach. But now that these sloughs are being created, the intent is that they will reproduce and those young will find their way back to continue that reproductive cycle. Lots of other fish have been found. Lots of other game species and non-game species of fish are also using the sloughs. So the slough is an area of refuge, food, and reproduction that is important for the fish that we're finding on site. That was the Mouth of Mud Creek project. Following the success of that 4 years ago, an initiative was undertaken to build more of these types of projects. And the second one was the Pleasant Grove floodplain restoration upstream, up valley, again in Henderson County, and it was on property that has also been acquired and is currently owned by the Conserving Carolina Land Conservancy. This is a 70-acre floodplain. It was formerly a golf course and a dairy farm. And we treated this similarly to Mud Creek floodplain with the addition of almost a mile of stream restoration included in the project for perennial streams flowing toward the French Broad. The photo on the left then is the dairy farm in May of 2006. The farm was sitting up here on the hill with the buildings. The purple colored pond is the waste storage pond for the dairy farm. And then the fields were used primarily for corn and hay production, and they included drainage ditches and Little Willow Creek, which flows through that floodplain. Some years after that photo, a golf course developer purchased the property. This was around 2011, and converted the entire dairy farm into a golf course. So the barns are gone. The holding pond was largely left to revegetate. It was emptied out and with the waste material properly disposed of. And then 2 large borrow pits were created to excavate earth to bring up and fill this area to create a golf play area at a higher elevation. This golf course actually went bankrupt and was never used for actual golfing, but the remnants of the golf course are still there, the greens, the tees, the sand traps, and sort of an interesting landscape to work on. The general idea here was that when the bankruptcy occurred, the Land Conservancy was able to acquire the land at a low price and generally convert it into a natural area. So I'll talk about the different components of that restoration now, including the stream restoration. I just want to point out Little Willow Creek runs from the west to the east, where it reaches its confluence with the French Broad River on the far right of the lower photo. The design plan for this project then, starting at the top, we had these 2 existing ponds, and we did have a goal to provide backwater slough access for fish. So we created this channel to connect the riverbed to the smaller of the 2 existing ponds. And the ultimate product here was a very large 7-acre backwater area that's accessible to fish currently. The larger pond was left intact. It is excellent waterfowl habitat, as well as other aquatic species that are using that pond. And there were some components along the French Broad River, including some stabilization of riverbanks, some removal of levees or berms to promote overbank flooding, and removal of a tremendous amount of invasive plant species, mostly being Chinese privet. Below the ponds in this image to the south is a long linear ditch that was carrying water, drainage water, directly into the French Broad River. That was rerouted into a wetland complex that is shown here as an oddly shaped area with lots of depressional wetland pockets that I'll show you from the ground in just a minute. And then continuing on, there was the stream restoration, which I'll talk about, reconnection of floodplain here, and also rerouting of several road ditches into various wetland features and small tributary streams that flow through the floodplain instead of as road ditches directly into the river. All the excavated soil was transported up to this fill area, which is now planted as a pollinator wildflower area on an upland part of the property. Construction was a year ago, finished up in spring of 2023. This photo shows the final excavation of the backwater slough. The soil was generally removed from the slough, working from the river up toward the pond. The pond was rather full at the time, and it had to be pumped down and lowered before final breaching of the soil dam between the pond and the backwater slough. And here's a photo several months later, lots of vegetation growing very rapidly. This is an aerial photo from June of 2023, just 2 months after construction. And this is that backwater slough. Again, 7 acres of habitat, accessible to fish. There is a monitoring station on this slough, similar to what we had seen earlier on the Mud Creek property. This is Little Willow Creek, restored meandering riffle pool system with a floodplain connection. The tributaries that come under the road, very small spring-fed streams, flow down through the valley. This is an old golf course pond that's now essentially a wetland feature. And again, the road ditch is plugged so that water would flow across the floodplain instead of along the road to the river. Some photos then of stream restoration, typical woody banks with wood toe revetments, log veins, log sills, woody riffles, all natural wood and rock material, and low banks planted with native plants. The tributary on the right, this photo is from just a week ago. And because the floodplain is very wet, the water table has risen because of plugging many of the various drainage features. The plant community is dominated by rushes and sedges, and the smaller tributaries are flowing through that plant community. This is 1 year after construction. Well, what's next? I mentioned there are other projects in the works. We are bidding a project out this month on a property owned by the State Wildlife Resources Commission. It's called the Kings Bridge property. It's approximately halfway between the two I just showed you. And it is a property of about 50 acres of former sod farm. It's this triangle here. The French Broad River flows past property, includes many of the same features we just discussed. We have another project on Cane Creek, Confluence, and Fletcher. We have a variety of other projects in the works, and in general, increasing interest among private landowners in doing work like this on floodplain properties for ecological reasons, fishing, hunting, generally promoting better conditions in the watershed. So this is really an opportunity to develop a whole lot of understanding about how overall ecosystem restoration can affect a big river basin and provide lots of different benefits to society. Thank you for your interest. And if anybody has questions, you can email me. You see my email address at the bottom here, and I will be happy to provide a tour if you ever visit Asheville or the areas around Western North Carolina. We have a number of projects we would love to show off if you're interested. Thanks for your time.
Hey, Greg, do you have to go, or do you have time for a couple questions?
I have time.
Hey. All right. Well, hey, folks on the call today. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Good, good. So we can open it up to discussion. I do have some questions that I asked Greg and he responded to. But if anybody else has any discussions or any thoughts they want to add about Greg's presentation today, feel free to we can start discussion on that now, or I can let you kind of hear the discussion Greg and I had for a couple questions that I had.
Hey Dave, this is Matt. I was just curious. I mean, these are really cool projects, and I love seeing what Greg's done out there. I was just curious, are they all grant funded projects, and do the grants flow to the state agency in North Carolina? And Greg is working for the state agency. I was curious as to who the ultimate client was on these projects.
Yeah, it's the Land Conservancy and the State Land Conservancy.
Okay,
And then
so
part of it is NC Wildlife Resource Conservation, but then Conserving Carolina is, and if anybody is in Carolina, they may be able to give me more detail, but that's like local agencies and local nonprofits associated with it as well. So it's between state and local nonprofits.
gotcha. Thank you.
Yeah, I think one of the neat things is, it's really looking at that marginal land and trying to say, hey, how can we reuse this marginal land in a beneficial way? All these places where they're doing this work, it's not really land that was good for farming anyways. People were trying to make it work for farming, but it hadn't been particularly good for farming. So Matt, it kind of reminded me of what you guys at Res did with the Lower Bodark project with the North Texas Water, where you took land that really wasn't great for agriculture and was able to convert it back into preservation.
Yeah, it does remind me a lot of that project, Dave. I love the scale of these projects and just how they're juxtaposed to the residential developments and whatnot. I just think they're really well placed projects.
Yeah, Greg Jennings was the guy that taught me how to do natural channel design, and in talking to Art Parola and Drew Alton, who may be on the line. I don't know if he is today, but he's going to be giving a talk in a couple of weeks for us. But they use a term called classical geomorphology, and in a lot of ways, kind of the idea of natural channel design is almost being seen more as a classical geomorphology, whereas a lot of times we have to be thinking outside of just channel restoration to meet the objectives for the species that we're trying to preserve or conserve in the habitat we're trying to produce that may not have a great reference. So I actually was intrigued by the way that Greg is using multiple tools from different design backgrounds to be able to come up with a very neat solution that it really, you're not going to read a textbook that tells you, hey, this is how you do habitat restoration for these species in Western North Carolina. All right, if there's no more comments, I'll let you hear my questions I had for Greg and then hear Greg's response on them. Cool. So most of the landowners, are they developers that have bought property and they're out of ag now, or are the ag landowners that are converting this to wildlands areas, or what's the stimulus for the landowner?
It's a variety of stimuli, Dave. It is, in some cases, it is land that just cannot function well as agriculture. It's low. It's been drained, but it's hard to maintain as drained farmland. Flooding is more frequent. Big floods wipe out an entire crop season. And in some cases, farmers are just giving up on certain properties and looking for somebody to take it off their hands. That's the case in the photo here. This is a former sod farm that was inundated with flooding over and over. And of course, it's hard to grow valuable sod when it's underwater. So it was acquired at a fair price, and it's being converted back to this. The golf course was a unique situation. It was a really bad idea to put a golf course in a floodplain, and the developer made lots of financial mistakes, and he, I'll just leave it at that. He made lots of mistakes, and he was happy to have somebody else take it off his hands. So, variety of reasons, but generally, where floodplains are frequently flooded, this is the best use of that property.
Makes sense. For the you showed a stormwater wetland that was formed as a braided channel.
Yes.
When you're looking at a stormwater treatment on floodplain functions, how important is a reference reach opposed to just understanding the processes of stormwater discharge?
Right. These two photos show that braided wetland. And Dave, the slope, the gradient here is 0.001, so 0.1%.
Yep.
The water moves very slowly. There is sorry about that.
That's all right.
Motorcycle driving by.
I couldn't even hear it on my side.
Okay, well, just pointing out, very low slope system here. The water stages up, it drops back down. It's more important for contact. Velocity management is not critical here. Shear stress is extremely low. Stream power, very slow, very low. Sediment transport, very low. It's all organic. So importantly would be providing surface contact for that water to be in contact with plants, plant roots, and rather than focusing on hydraulics or sediment transport as a design factor here. There are reference conditions that we looked at from aerial photos of meandering braided wetlands that, for example, in coastal areas all around the Gulf Coast, some of the Atlantic coast, you can find braided wetlands that literally by looking at aerial photos, we could gain good reference information on design. In this particular case, we had a fixed budget and we had fixed amount of area, and we were able to maximize the water contact with the edges of this area as our design guidance.
Yeah, I think that's common with a lot of low slope, low sediment systems.
Yep.
You know, the one thing that I'll kind of ask you about, you know, I've been mentioning to people the last year that you know, all ecosystem restoration has to be process based, but some require reference for form and others don't. And I think that's kind of what you were saying there is what it sounded like, is that this is just one that doesn't really require much of a reference for form. I mean, it may be from an aesthetic standpoint that you want to do it, but from a functional standpoint, it's probably not that important.
That's right. It's a good way to put it, Dave. Similarly, the backwater sloughs, we were able to find some aerial photos of what a backwater slough looked like. And in this photo on the right, you see one of these sloughs, and it's sort of narrow at the mouth, and it gets a little bigger. It's sort of a big bulb, and it has a little bend to it. And that's what we came up with. But honestly, it could have looked different and provided similar functions. What we were told is the muskie swim in, and then they need a big cul-de-sac to turn around and swim back out. And so that's what they have there.
Yeah.
So fish biology behavior in some ways dictates the design more than, say, a reference condition or fluvial geomorphology in that case.
Yeah, yeah, no,
It's
and
re-
I see that too.
It's really important to engage with lots of scientists who look at things differently, certainly than engineers or geomorphologists. And if we're designing for habitat, we have to know that the system will provide the optimal habitat, and that the biologists know that certainly better than engineers.
Yeah, I think and this is just kind of a thought with a lot of the pushes for rewilding rivers and for restoration. Restoration looks so different in so many locations. The more
Yep.
that we can lean on, the things that we're trying to do for restoration, the processes we're trying to restore to, and the less that we focus on the differences in tools that we use, I think that's better for our industry in general.
Sure.
Well, I appreciate it, Greg. I
Yeah.
really appreciate you sharing time with us today. And
Absolutely.
we'll share this probably not
All right. Well, thank you guys. I appreciate everybody that was on the call today. We can stay on the line and answer any questions from this week or from last week if anything comes up for discussion. But if not, have a wonderful week. Thanks a lot. Hey, Matt.
Hey, Dave.
Hey, how are you guys doing with the cleanup after the storms?
It's been, I mean, doing okay. It's been quite a challenge. We were fortunate in that the tornado came by the house, but did not go over the house or didn't damage the house directly. And none of the trees that it knocked down hit my house. But pretty much every large tree in my yard, I mean, I have a big yard, is gone.
Yeah. Oh, wow.
Just took it all out. I mean, either it knocked it down, uprooted it, broke it in half, or pushed it to where it was leaning in such a way that I had to go ahead and take it down before it fell on somebody or fell on my house. It was pretty bad.
So have you been
Have
taking them all down have you been taking them all down yourself, or have you had somebody come in to do that for you?
I had a tree expert come in to take down the really dangerous ones, and then Rez was incredibly generous and sent a team of guys from our nursery to help me for a couple of days. And they
That's
did
pretty
more.
amazing.
I did more in 2 days with those guys than I could have done in 2 months by myself or just with friends and family. I would have never made a dent in it compared to what those guys did in 2 days. I mean, we probably cut up and hauled off about 27 mature trees, they were over 40 feet tall, 50, 60 feet tall, big trees, oak trees, hackberry trees, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So it looks a lot better than it did. It was quite overwhelming. When I pulled up and looked at it, I thought, oh my gosh, how am I ever going to get this place to looking decent again? But it's not bad right now. I still got work to do, but it's in a lot better shape than it was.
Man, that's cool.
Thanks for asking.
Good. Well, glad to hear that, man. Did the rains last week have any effect on you, or?
Nah, it's just a hot, wet beginning to the summer here in Houston. Kind of typical. It'll all dry out and turn into a big dust bowl in July and August, and then we'll get rains again, probably by a hurricane in September and October. You know how it goes. That's the system. That's
that sounds kind of. That's it, man. So, all right. Well, hey, have a great week, Matt.
You too, Dave. Give my best to Abigail and the kids. Have a good one.
I will. Thanks, Blake.